Popala River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Today I will be splitting my time with the member for Saskatoon West. So, Madam Speaker, I'm here to speak on Bill C-81, an act to ensure a barrier-free Canada. This is an important bill. It is one that we should all be talking about. We should be really considering what does it mean to have a barrier-free Canada. C-81 establishes several important new officials and agencies. For example, the Accessibility Commissioner in charge of enforcement, a Canadian Accessibility Standards Development Organizations, which will create model accessibility standards that the government can enact as regulations, a Chief Accessibility Officer to advise and report on progress and needed improvements. It will look at this in terms of what is under the federal jurisdiction, and that is a start. That is a positive step in the right direction. I am concerned, however, that there are some significant gaps. The majority, Madam Speaker, of these gaps are really around allowing these organizations to decide instead of really enforcing. And I think when we talk about persons with disabilities, they are put in positions that are often uncomfortable. And it is our job as Canadians, as it is the job of this government, to look at what those barriers are and make a difference. So right now we see that C-81 does not have any mandatory timelines for implementation. This concerns me as action is required, and the best way to measure action is outcomes. It also doesn't require all federal government laws, policies, programs to be studied through a disability law lens. I think that's really important as we look into the future of this country. This bill also gives several public agencies or officials far too much sweeping power to grant partial or blanket exemptions to specific organizations from important parts of this bill. Madam Speaker, that's very concerning to me. And it also separates enforcement and implementation in a confusing way over 4 different public agencies. Rather, it should be providing people with disabilities a single service location or one-stop shop that they really require to get the action done that they need. Madam Speaker, recently I was having a discussion about this bill to a young man who is in university who has severe dyslexia. He also happens to be my son. As a parent of a child with a severe learning disability, I had a lot of learning to do. He was diagnosed when he was in elementary school, and it was very weird for me to walk around the world and recognize how fast I recognize words and what I just gather by seeing words around me every day. And for my son, he really lives in a world where he is basically always surrounded by a foreign language. So when I think about traveling internationally in a community where I can't read the signs, I don't understand what the ingredients are, I don't understand how to read the menu, it's challenges like that that my son faces every day. And he did well in school, and obviously he's in university, and one of the hardest parts for him and for his family was how many people just saw him as very intelligent, as very competent, which he absolutely was, but they didn't understand the challenges that he faced because of his learning disability. And how many educators thought that if they did something differently, they would be able to fix him. Madam Speaker, I want to be really clear. These are not bad people or bad educators. In fact, if it wasn't for many of them, he would not be in university where he is today. I specifically think of Mr. Murphy, Dr. Morrow, and Ms. Vonnegut, who really supported him. They understood fundamentally that he was not broken, he's just dyslexic. But Madam Speaker, what he said to me this past weekend was really profound. He said to me, people don't want people with disabilities to be successful. If we succeed, it means that they will have to accommodate us. And I really hope that the people in this House hear that, because it was really hard for me to hear that. Because this is a serious reality, that accommodation is perceived as a burden, as something that is simply often seen as too much work. I had another experience this August where I spent 2 hours in a wheelchair. I learned so much and recognized that I just touched the bare surface of understanding what it is to live in a wheelchair. The reality for me was that if I wanted to get out of that chair, I just had to stand up. And I want to thank my constituent Karen for taking me out that day. She's been in a chair for quite a while and was an amazing teacher and does this with a lot of political figures. So for me, it was an opportunity for a very brief time to experience the world through her eyes and through her experience. And I learned a lot of things that were really frustrating. I learned that my arms are not very strong. I learned that the Canada Post in Comox on Comox Avenue is very welcoming and accessible, but getting up that ramp sure gave me sore arms. I learned about the placement of buttons when you want to have a door open and what it means when there's a small dip or hill and how much harder it is to get up it. I remember watching her coast around at an angle to push the button and then get in the door on an entranceway that was on a hill. I learned about how challenging it can be to cross the street because people often don't look for people at that height, and so how she has to sit there and wait till people meet her in the eye. I went through numerous stores, and I'm very grateful to all the local businesses that are used to her doing this route, but it was amazing for me to see and feel how a small display on the floor would actually mean so much more work to maneuver and try to figure out how to get around it. And I came to the realization that there's a lot of parking spots that are not as accessible. You know, we see that symbol on the ground at a parking lot, and we think, oh good, look at that's accessible parking. But I saw parking that had that symbol that were definitely not accessible. And what was most startling for me was when I posted about that experience, I remember one woman's response. Her response as a woman who has a severe disability is, it's just simply easier to stay at home. So we have to recognize that when we do not create an accessible environment, an accessible Canada, we are leaving people out. I remember speaking with another gentleman in Campbell River who was also in a wheelchair, and he spoke about showing the city the challenges he faces every day and how the response was wanting to be helpful but very overwhelmed because they simply don't have the resources they require to actually make it more accommodating for people. I feel for municipalities who have so little resources and so much of the responsibility. If we want to build a barrier-free Canada, then working with communities must be a fundamental part of this process. And I want to make it clear because my son always makes me be accountable for this. I don't think we should be doing this out of pity. I think that if I felt sorry for my son, he would definitely not appreciate it and take me to task. We should do this because we want everyone to participate in our country, because consideration is about acknowledging that anything could happen to any one of us at any moment, and that if it does, we have to rely on one another. And if tomorrow I can't walk, or I can't see, or I can't read, it does not make me or any person less. So, Madam Speaker, I just want to come back to what my son said again. People don't want people with disabilities to be successful. If we succeed, it means they have to accommodate us. We can't hide from the reality that there is truth in this statement. I'm not positive in any way that that is the intention of our country, the intention of people, but the impact is something that can be measured. It's something that is experienced by people who have different challenges. I really want to see a Canada that is accessible to everyone, that looks at opportunities that we can open the door. And I understand that this bill is really focusing on what we can do federally. And I hope and I challenge all of us to do so much more. So I'm happy to support this bill. I will be very hopeful that when it goes to committee, there's a lot of work done and a lot of discussion happening about how we can actually make this more fulsome. I want to take out a lot more of the options and actually have stuff in the bill that makes action happen. I think that when you look at people who have different challenges, they are tired of hearing things. They really want to just see concrete action on the ground. We know that poverty rates are considerably higher for people with disabilities, and we must be mindful of what that impact is for them in terms of going out and having the energy to be accessible. I remember Karen talking to me about the price differences for a wheelchair or the tires for a wheelchair and how she actually goes to a bike shop to get tires because it's so significantly cheaper. We need to be looking at these issues, and we need to do it because it is simply the best thing to do for our country. I also just want to mention that as a seniors critic for the NDP, we know that seniors with disabilities face a higher rate of poverty than people without disabilities. And so we really need to be able to be comprehensive about this and have that discussion. So again, I will support this bill. I'm happy this bill is here. I'm happy that this is something that we're discussing. I'm happy always to talk about the disabilities that we see and the ones that are invisible. And I think that the committee has a lot of work to do, and I hope it comes back with a lot more action and a lot less meaningless promises. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Whitby. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank my honourable colleague for her speech and for the passion with which she spoke to this issue, using examples of not only her son but people in our community. I've had the opportunity to have a number of roundtables in Whitby on this particular piece of legislation that we're proposing, the Accessibility Act. And one of the things that they talked about was the fact that they don't want to be cared for. They want to be able to do things themselves. And so I really did appreciate some of your sentiments. One of the other things that people in Whitby spoke about was the fact that they wanted to see compliance. They wanted to ensure that organizations were compliant. And when we look at the Act, it grants the Accessibility Commissioner, the Canadian Transportation Agency, CRTC powers of inspection and investigation. How important are these powers to ensure that there is compliance and that we're truly making an inclusive Canada?
And I just want to remind the member to address the questions and comments to the chair. The honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. You know, I always appreciate when we work hard in our constituencies and listen to the people that we represent. I really do fundamentally believe that we are a voice for our riding, and I appreciate her doing her work around this bill. You know, I absolutely agree. I think people, I think of all the years of trying to support my son, and it's very hard to support somebody when you have no idea what their experience is, but you're trying your best to be there, and how frustrated he was by the barriers in his way, but how he was even more frustrated when people tried to help him when he wasn't asking for it. And so I think it's very important that when we look at compliance, that we look at ways that we make sure that the actions are happening, and that we also make sure that the dignity is given to the people. I mean, I can tell you right now, when I spent that time with Karen, you know, I learned important things, like when you're going up a hill, you don't just hold the outside of the wheelchair, you hold the actual tire, because you got to get moving up there. And I just struggled behind her. So, you know, if it came down to an arm wrestling contest or something like that, she's going to win. She's got incredible strength and power, and we have to make sure that in everything we do, we're opening doors, because we should not be in a country where we leave people behind. Our very existence could depend on it.
The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the honourable member for her speech today. And there are several areas of concern with respect to this piece of legislation that I too, and I know on this side, are hopeful that when it does get to committee, that we're going to be able to work out. In particular, the issue, and I know the members spoke about this, the fact that there's no mandatory timelines, that there's $290 million that's being spent over 6 years, but within that 6 years, there's no measurements, there's no timeframes in which the action is to be taken. So I was wondering if the honourable member can expand a little bit more on her concern and what she's hoping to see once it gets to committee and then comes back to Parliament. Thank you.
The honourable member for North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for that important question. You know, I think that when we look at this legislation, some of the things that I'm hoping to see change when they go to committee is really a lot more concrete measures. We need to have something so that it's not just going out, money's flowing, but the actual on-the-ground work that needs to be done to support people with disabilities isn't done. So I hope it goes to the committee. I hope that work is done. I'm really interested to see what the witnesses come forward and share with us. I think that, you know, at the end of the day, and this is so important, words are not enough. It's really about action. And so what we need to see in this legislation is action, and it be measurable, so that we know that these outcomes are really making life a better thing for people who have certain challenges. Thank you.
We have time for a very brief question. The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her very thoughtful and moving comments, especially illustrating the poignant point from her son, the lessons that we can learn from people with disabilities as well. To this end, we talk about this, and with Bill C-81 before us, the government talks about how we must move forward, but yet the bill itself does not require, for example, for us to work with the provincial or municipal governments in the community to realize accessibility. And I wonder whether or not you can comment on that and whether or not we should make that change at committee.
Very brief answer from the member from North Island Powell River.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for this really important question. I absolutely think this is something that needs to be looked at in committee. You know, when I talked about the challenges that the community members in my different communities across my large riding North Island Powell River, what we really need to see is supports there on the ground so that people can have a more fulsome life, and let's get moving. It's time for action.